We read this verse last week, and we're going to stay with the Ten Commandments for a while as we continue this theme of renewal and understanding God and coming to some other ideas about that. But chapter 20, verses 4 through 6 says this, and this is the second commandment. No carved gods of any size, shape, or form, or anything whatever, whether of things that fly or walk or swim. Do not bow down to them, and don't serve them, because I am God, your God, and I am a most jealous God, punishing the children for any sins their parents pass on to them, to the third, and yes, even to the fourth generation of those who hate me. But I'm unswervingly loyal to the thousands who love me and keep my commandments. And we will talk about those. And the second commandment is one of the most broken commandments. And you may think that that isn't necessarily the case because, well, how can we don't bow down to idols and we don't, carve anything like they did back in ancient Israel. So how can this be one of the most broken commandments that we have? And simply it is because we try to violate this, or we violate this in a lot of ways. A lot of us make a picture of a God, or a lot of us try to construct some kind of box to put God into, or however you want to word that, and then we leave it there. And then when we start learning things about God, we put the things we like into the box, and all of the things we don't like are not in the box. So we make God into our own image. This isn't really talking about things that, make images of other gods and worshiping other gods. This says, don't make any images of what God is represented of. Don't make any images that do not show fully the power and the mightiness of who God is. Because when we're talking about renewal, one of the tough things for us to do, and I speak for myself too, is to overcome a lot of what we've been taught our entire life. The way that we have been taught to look to God, to how we define God, when we close our eyes and we come up with a picture of God, oftentimes that picture is because of something that we were told when we were kids and just something that is stuck in our mind. And I'm not saying that those are bad in and of themselves. What I'm saying is that we have to understand that God is bigger than we think. That these images that we have, these symbols that we have, and I think there's a slide up there that says God is bigger than you think, because we need to remind ourselves of this all of the time. Because this commandment is trying to attempt or to get us to stop attempting to define God on our own terms and try to restrict God to what are these images of something that God is less than of. Because we cannot define God in a way that accurately represents the mightiness and the power and the hugeness of what God truly is. But like I said, we try, we attempt. We come to church so that we can try to put all the pieces together to form an image of what God is. We come to different churches because their image of God fits what we think that image of God should be. Or we listen to people and we read books from authors who kind of support the image that we want to have of God, or that we feel comfortable with of God, and all of these things because we try to fit God, again, into that box that we already made. But it's interesting that a lot of times, if I really was honest with myself, if I had to write out a list of the qualities of God, very quickly God would look like me. And you can laugh, because all of you in here would be guilty of the same thing. God would take on some of the qualities that I like, or that I think are good. Or God would start to, look like something that God really is not. I mean, and it's very dangerous. We all want to think that I have the right version of God. That is why there are over 30,000 different Christian denominations. That is why if you look in a phone book here in Darke County, Ohio, you will find hundreds of churches. Because we all want to say, and I say we because as much as we would say that we don't want to do that here, we're probably guilty of it. We all think that we have the version of God that everybody else needs. So we think we are the standard bearers for this without realizing how distorted those images really are. And let's again be honest. If God looks like me and acts like me, and if I can understand who God is, we are all in trouble. Because that's not God. If I can understand everything that God does, and I can have answers for everything, we might as well just pack it up. Because we're going to go down very fast. You know, Anne Lamott has a quote, and I like this quote, if you can pull it up there. It says, "You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do." And I've said that before. I remind myself of that all of the time. And I like how it's just simple and to the point. Because that gives me an idea of when I start to make God into my own image. When I start talking to people and I start saying things like, well, you know, God's not happy with those people. Or you know what, God can't like what they're doing. Or you know what, they're wrong and here they need to do what I'm doing. You know, we start to define it in all of this way and we start to realize that, hey, I don't mind this God anymore. Because look, everybody who I think is out, God already knows is out. And I'm in the circle. That is a very, very dangerous thing to do. So we have to come up with some idea of how we can say, you know what? These images and these symbols have a place and they serve a purpose, but they are not the end picture. They are not the entire definition of who God is. We can go back to saying because God is bigger than we think. So all of these images, all of these things, serve a purpose. Sometimes we need God to be a healer. Sometimes we need God to bring comfort. Sometimes we need God to be a peacemaker. Sometimes we need God to be a father image. Sometimes we need God to be a mother image. All of these things help us understand what is going on in our life around us, and all of these things help us understand how God plays a part in them. But the danger is when I choose one of those things and dismiss all the others. When I say that God is this person in the sky with a white beard and white skin and a white robe, and that's who God is, severely limits the power that God has. Severely limits what God is capable of if I put God in a corner and say that's all there is to God. And this is a tough thing for people. We wrestle with this. Because we don't want to mess with God. Or we think that God has to have certain attributes and that is it. And it means something to us. It's passionate and we get emotional about it. But how much bigger can God be if we say, you know what, that's just one part. Look at what God can do here. Look at what God can do here. Look at what if God was doing this. It's not all. You know, like this Celtic prayer I want to read this morning. I think this illustrates a good point. It says this: "The lights of heaven were imagined by her. The textures of earth were thought by her. The power of the wind was her delight. The creatures of earth, sea, and sky were painted by her. The sense of the body and appetites of the soul were named by her. She was present at the birth of all things. Renew us in your wisdom, O God, for she is the midwife of our beginnings." And there's two ways we can look at this. One is they talk about wisdom as a her. Okay, and in the Greek language, wisdom is feminine. But also you can say that her there represents God. That they're saying God is this female presence. And I chose that because people struggle all of the time with their image of God. Is God male or is God female? Is God feminine or is God masculine? And we can get into debates about that. But again, what power there is to understand that in God it is all. That in God there is both male and female. There is both feminine and masculine. In God there is all of these things wrapped up all together. And when we are ushered into the presence of God, we can feel all of those different aspects. We can engage with what we need at that moment and realize that when the moment changes, God has those other attributes and symbols and images that will come and speak to me. But how sad it is if I relegate God to one of those aspects, and then I'm in need of something and I don't think God can do it. What danger it is to say that God is only this and nothing else. We can never give an accurate picture to people. We can never receive an accurate picture for ourselves if we make God into these images or idols that we think represent God, but it's just a small portion. You know, I know that either I've said it or you've probably heard this before, but there's always this image or this story, this metaphor that says that you had 4 blind guys, and they were all brought towards an elephant. And when they were obviously there was 4 of them, so they were brought to different parts of that. And they were told to describe what they feel and describe the elephant, to paint a picture of what that elephant looks like. And one of them, had the leg and said, "Oh, it's like a mighty trunk." Another person had the trunk, and it said, the trunk of the tree for the leg. And then somebody went to the trunk and said, "Oh, it's like a branch on a tree, and it curves and it moves." And somebody had the tail and said, "Oh, it's like a stick." And some of the stories have different areas, but they didn't have the whole picture. And they said, "Oh, this elephant must look like this because of what I just saw, this one small glimpse." But if we start listening to everybody else, and we start to say, "Let me hear your story of who God is. Let me understand what you see of God. Let me understand all of these different attributes," we start to put the picture together. And we start to see how big God is. And we start to see how powerful God is. And we start to see why the second commandment says, "Don't relegate me to an image. Don't relegate me to one idea. Use it. Let it speak to you, but understand that there's so much more to God. There is so much more if we are just open to listening and feeling that presence and seeing it all around us." I think that it is getting our attention to understand that instead of trying to define God all of the time, we just have to find God. We just have to be in the presence of God and let that presence be whatever it needs to be. Whether that needs to be a father image or a mother image or a masculine image or a feminine image or a old guy in the sky with the white beard image. Whatever it may be. But it becomes powerful and it becomes bigger when we can say, "All right, God, this is who I needed at this moment. But the next moment I may need something else." And we can all think of in our lives when we bowed our heads and we prayed to God and we needed God to be a certain thing. And we needed God to say, "Okay, I'm going to come and I'm going to speak to you and I'm going to touch you in the way that you need to know." And how sad it would be if only I had one idea of what that was. And I did not allow God to speak to me any other time. And it's tough, again, to undo a lot of the images that we have. It is tough. But we can do it. And part of being transformed and renewed and understanding that God is bigger is that God says, "Okay, John, I can take you and I can make you into what you're supposed to be. Okay, John, you have a small glimpse of who I am now, but let me show you how big it can be." God is bigger than we think. The second part of the sermon, and it ties into this, is about this closing hymn that we are going to sing. And I kept thinking about ways of how to tie this in. And it kept speaking to me. So part 2 of this sermon, if you will, about how God is bigger, is Just as I am, on page 516, and you can turn there in your hymnals if you want. Or if you know the stanzas, that's fine too. But why it spoke to me, and I'm going to confess this morning, this is one of the hymns that I do not like. It has a lot of imagery in there that I don't tend to agree with. It talks about the blood and the cross and all of these things. However, when I was thinking about it, I kept saying, I'm doing the exact same thing that I just said we shouldn't do. I'm putting my thoughts, my ideas into this hymn and saying it only means one thing, and to me, that thing is negative. But how powerful this hymn is. How powerful it is to help me understand that because God is bigger, these things that are spoken in this hymn are possible. Because God is bigger, God is able to transform me. Because even if I don't want to spend a lot of time on the blood and the judgment and the condemnation that a lot of Christians relegate the idea of God to, I have to admit that I have things in my life that need God's attention. I have to admit that I need help in a lot of ways. And if I don't pay attention to some of those attributes of God, I am in very much danger of doing what the second commandment tells me not to do. So as much as I wrestle with this and the antiquated words and the ideas in it, it still is a powerful thing. And if you go through these stanzas, just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and thou biddest me to come. I can read that and say it is because of Christ. It is through Christ that God revealed who God was. And God says, come, because you are worthy. Just as I am. The second stanza, just as I am and waiting not to rid my soul of every blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot. Again, it is Christ who shows us who we can be. That we can be bigger and we can be better and we can be transformed into who God is calling us. And even though I don't like that whole life and death model, it's an important piece. Just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict, many a doubt, fightings and fears within and without. We all wrestle demons. We all wrestle with things. Life is chaotic and life is hard. But we have a God. We have a God that can calm storms. We have a God that is so powerful and so big that Christ can step out into a boat in the midst of a storm and say, calm down, and the seas calm. Life is messy, but how big God is to say, okay, let's clean this up. What other gods can do that? What other gods can calm the storms of our life? None. God is big. Just as I am, poor, wretched, blind, sight, riches, healing of the mind, all I need in thee to find. No matter where we find ourselves, poor, rich, able to see or blind, hurting, suffering, or okay, either way, God is our God. And God supplies what we need. Just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because they promise, I believe. Again, God is big, and God made us a promise, and God is not going to fall through on that. And because of that promise, we can be transformed. We can be changed. Just as I am, thy love unknown hath broken every barrier down. Now to be thine, thine alone. And because of God's love, we can stand before God with nothing between us. Why did I read all of that? Because I wrestle with the images in there. And I own that. But I also allow God to be bigger and allow God to say, okay, John, you may not like that, but it means something. So how can we read that in a little bit of a different way where we can still say, look at how powerful God is. And just as I am, no matter where I've been, where I'm going, or what is happening in our life, God is my God. So I challenge you this morning, rip up your boxes. As we talk about being renewed and understanding God in new ways, in order to do that, we got to strip away some of the old things. I'm not telling you to throw them away. I'm just telling you to rip up the box and let it be a mess for a while. And then let us understand, to John here this morning, I never have to recreate a box again. I can just live in the mess. And that's tough because I want God defined. But if I can live in the mess, or I can live in the presence of God, I can pull and grab and touch all of those things, all of those big things God is, all of the time. My God is big. God is bigger than we think. That, to me, is what the second commandment is talking about. Let God be God. You know, I read once, and I'm sure I am repeating myself, but it said, how did it go? I saw it on some sign, and it said, I totally lost that now. But it had to do with the fact that, I know there is a God. I'm not God. That's the simple point of that. There is a God. I'm not God. We all think we are. At least I do. When I pray, all right, God, this is what's happening. Okay, God, this person made me upset. All right, God, there can't possibly be any room in heaven for these type of people. Okay, God, you tell me to love, but I'm going to hate. Okay, God, you tell me to read this Bible, but I'm going to throw out 3/3 of it or 3/4 of it because I don't like it. Okay, God, this hymn is a powerful hymn, but I'm not singing it because I'm stubborn and I don't like the words. And you know what God says? You have that right, John, but you are not going to get an accurate image, and you are not going to feel how powerful I am if you do that. I limit God. My choice. But if I can just quiet myself and say, okay, I don't like it, but I can wrestle with it. Okay, I may not like so-and-so, but we can make it work. Okay, this or that or whatever it is, we can just say, you know what? God is God. I'm not. Let God sort it out. It's kind of freeing. It really is. And I can tell I'm getting older and maturing because as I'm getting older and maturing, and hopefully Amanda can back me up on this, I don't argue as much. Or I get to a point, I take that back, I like to argue. But I pick them a little better, okay? Sometimes if somebody wants to pick a fight with me or argue something, especially about God or a certain topic, I'm getting to the point where I say, I don't care, and I can walk away. I have nothing to prove anymore. All I have to prove is that God is God. And if God is as big as if I'm going to let God be as big as God is, that means there's going to have to be room for a lot of people. There is no point in doing it. God is God. Nothing I do or say or try to defend is going to make God any smaller or any larger, because God is going to do what God does. But if I want to be blessed, if I want to be in the presence of God, if I want to feel all of those aspects of God, if I want and need God to be a mother, if I need God to be a father, if I need God to hit me in the head, if I need God to comfort me, if I need God to do this or that, God can do it because it's all encompassed in it. You wrestle with your own images of God. But let it be big. let it be so big that God can do what God is going to do. It's up to us if we are going to limit God or let God bless us. Let us pray. Lord, just as that hymn says, just as we are, we come. We come with our outdated versions of who you are. We come with our broken down boxes, and we come with our newly formed boxes, and we come with all of these ideas. But it doesn't matter, because all you say is to come. And if we come and we bow in your presence, we will realize how big and how powerful you are. So help us as we continue to renew ourselves. Help us to be transformed into who you are calling us to be. And it starts with understanding that you are bigger than we think. So just as we are, we come. And all of God's people said. One last thought that I forgot to put in the sermon because I get off on tangents. There's a verse in that passage I read that talks about God punishing generations. You know, it was pretty harsh. And I didn't want to skip over that. But one of the commentators that I was reading this week said that that is the danger that God is trying to stop. That the image that I make of God is the image I'm going to pass down to the next generation. And then that's the image that they will pass down to the next generation. So we have to be very careful what image we have, because it will carry on. And like we have said, it is hard to overcome that. So again, let our God be bigger. And I leave you with this blessing. The blessings of heaven, the blessings of earth, the blessings of sea and of sky on those we love this day, and on every human family, the gifts of heaven, the gifts of earth, the gifts of sea and of sky, and all of God's people said, Amen.